Do we lose Ben?
We have for the time being. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for that. We had an issue with Hangouts, but we're back now. And so we're just going to let Harry carry on from his train of thought where he was. All right.
Sure. So I think the point we were on is basically that Ben's back.
Hello.
Hey.
What up?
What happened there?
Hangouts crashed or something. We're live again, BTW.
I see.
Yeah, so I'll just continue. So I think where we got to was that obviously, even though it sounds brutal from what we were discussing before, that it's just basically going to be strip away the welfare state and it's every man for himself. It's like that's not necessarily going to be the case, because all of the tax revenue, not all, but much far reduced tax revenue that would be taken in order to safeguard people, that revenue would not just be retained by everyone. The thing is, private charities would end up filling a massive void. And as with most things private, they would almost certainly be more efficient than many of the government charities now, because they have no incentive to be efficient. There's no need for government to be efficient, because it can just increase taxes through the use of force, which is what they do time and time again. But if you had private charities come in, which basically it's be efficient at your charity and what you do or go bust, that would, again, I think it would actually be better for the people that are in need of short-term relief or, long-term relief than what we have at the moment. But again, to go through that structural change would be really difficult. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on that, to be honest.
Well, surely one of Marx's most damaging ideas was that the cure to social ills have to be framed in economic terms. I was just thinking what academic agent I think you were saying just now. We think of John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, so the era of the Great Depression. The 19th century was the period closest to pure unrestrained individualism, and it was also the period of the greatest flowering of charitable activity. And I suppose it was these industries who were instrumental in building and developing the country, whereby one would have access to more opportunity. I think there's something to be said for having a modest confidence to improve one's own lot. That's certainly what happens in the Grapes of Wrath, when the farmers are forced to go in search of living off the fat of the land, as you say. I'm not sure what is the moral. It's interesting that it keeps coming back to having some sort of moral duty. It sounds like that's. I don't know if that's what you were saying, Has.
There is something though that people forget, I think, because this is one of the great tricks of socialists and also of people who are really keen on state solutions for things. In the 19th century, all of those supposedly greedy capitalists that are so routinely kind of lampooned and satirized, they built basically all of the schools, all of the hospitals, all of London. I mean, not without barely any state funding at all. All the bridges, so many things in the 19th century were built through private enterprise, and then at a certain time in history, the state appropriated them. And after a generation, you can't imagine how it could be another way. So, I mean, the schools are a very good example. How, basically, they got to near, it wasn't quite, but they had a very, very high amount of people in the country being privately educated by the late 1800s. The state appropriates it, and all of a sudden people imagine that if the state hadn't have done that, people wouldn't have an education or they couldn't afford it, which is not true. It's just not true. But this is how history gets rewritten and how people come to adopt a priori position that they never, ever have to think about.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of, I don't know who wrote it, but Thomas Sowell refers to what he calls the democratic plantation. So the idea that government needs people to rely on them through welfare. But you're right, these private enterprises are precisely what has been instrumental in, I think, a liberal way of life. I don't know. Do you know that expression, the democratic plantation?
What is the democratic plantation? Well, where does it? Where does
so it's the idea that slavery still exists through dependency on welfare. but it's just transitioned into a society rather than on a plantation.
Yeah, in America, this concept is discussed really frequently, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's essentially learned helplessness. I mean, it's like the people in the working class areas that vote for Labour. If they're in an area where there's not much, or they don't perceive that there are job opportunities for them, they'll naturally vote for the people that will appear to take care of them, without thinking about, well, actually, what could happen if people just didn't pay so much tax and could build businesses and provide opportunities. They want the short term kind of care instead.
In terms of the reduction of jobs being due to automation and that sort of thing, and their short-term impact, one of the commenters, Frederick, has just mentioned that basically, if a man buys, if you automate the process that produces apples, for instance, and suddenly an apple costs half as much, then Apple consumers will have twice as much capital in order to. They don't have twice as much capital, sorry, but they have more purchasing power because they're spending half their money then on apples instead of all of it, and the other half can go towards either improving their lot or investing in other areas.
Yeah, it's the gains in the efficiency of the free market. Like that's one of the best things that one of the greatest human inventions. Like people don't seem to talk about the market as an invention, but like that concept, like I think that's one of the greatest things humanity's ever come up with. And yeah, that example of the apple, like it's simplistic, but it's true to some extent, and it means that resources can be allocated as efficiently as possible without humans trying to organize it together, which is where, as we've discussed with socialism, we're not so great when it comes to all organizing, but when our own individual interests can be aligned in a way that can benefit each other, that is when the greatest gains in humanity have been made. Like, and that there is one example though, which I do want to bring up, which I'm interested to hear about, which goes against the idea of what this guy said in the chat, and also I think it's something that is important, which is the power of the monopoly. So obviously, if you have a market, let's say train travel, for example, or water, like the water supply, in some cases, you have a single supplier of a good. They can charge far above what the good costs them to produce, but purely because there's no competition. So in those cases where there's a monopoly, do people think it's correct that the state should intervene and own that?
No. I've made a video about this called "Why I'm Against Antitrust Laws."
Antitrust laws is one thing though, but monopolies specifically.
So I made one called "Why I'm Against Antitrust Laws," and I made another one very recently about Facebook. So you could go and have a look at those. But just to summarize why I think this is because the scenarios that people talk about are most often hypothetical. Monopolies can only really come about with state collusion. Think about this now. How are you going to get a monopoly without having somebody to keep competition out artificially? How I mean, if I'm running a train line and my fares are so high that people could stop using it, that doesn't change the fact that there's a demand for a train. So unless you have the state intervening to stop somebody else building a train track, how are you going to stop it?
What about patents and stuff, though? I mean, if you're saying about monopolies in terms of train line, I understand there's always needed for a train line. But when it comes down to, say, a company that's a tech company that gets to a point where they can buy the patents of technology they implement into their technology, they surely can get to a point where they own enough that no one else could create something to rival them.
I mean, you take something like Facebook in that regard, where you think that basically they have virtually no competition at the moment that is successful at the level that they are. They control the internet alongside giants like Google.
They've bought companies like Oculus. They've bought, I think they bought Instagram. They've bought WhatsApp. They've bought, I can't remember what else they've bought, but they've been acquiring loads of different companies. So you have to think, well, if a company can do that and grow so quickly, how the hell can a competitor actually arrive? And I'm not saying there's not an opening for competition.
Think about how short-sighted what you just said is. Where was Facebook 20 years ago?
Well, it was around the time where there's things like MySpace and stuff, but things didn't take off in the same way as Facebook did. Facebook got the formula right.
But what's to stop I mean, they got the formula right until it's wrong. What's to stop that happening again?
Well, if they have the buying power to buy any startups, then there won't be anything to rival it.
Okay, so did Blockbuster get? I mean, Blockbuster had every single competitive advantage going. Are they the people who control Netflix now?
They're not, but at the same time, there was a technology emerging.
So why do we always look at what we imagine might happen as opposed to what has actually happened in history? You know, I mean, Sarah mentioned Thomas Sowell. Read Basic Economics, and he goes through about, I don't know, 20 examples of people who've made a prediction of a company taking over, and then looking at what that prediction looks like in 30 years, and it just never turns out the way that you think.
The vision of the anointed, yeah.
IBM in like business, where they were the first big computing company, and they're like, oh my god, IBM is going to run every single computing system in the world, and it's like, well, not anymore. Like
they don't need to. IBM actually still make a lot of the technology that goes into PCs now. They just don't sell the PCs.
Yeah, they're around, but they're not what they once were.
So moving back to property, because I think we're getting a bit off topic here. So the right to own property and for it not to be taken from you is an important aspect of economic freedom. In fact, one of the core tenets. But should we, as let's say we're in charge of the UK right now, protect society from asset owners, particularly foreign asset owners who buy properties, for instance, in high-rise areas of London, and so any wealth that is generated by these properties gets funneled away from the economy? And it can be quite damaging, particularly with leaving where you see property as not a home, but as basically just another asset, like a watch or a car or something.
I mean, for me, this is one of very few areas where I would consider intervention, and the reason I would consider intervention is because those foreign investors are a market distortion that is predicated on dictatorships. Most of those people who are billionaires coming in from elsewhere made their money in corrupt regimes which extort populations in exchange for tremendous wealth, and that is the reason why I'd consider it, because very few people have the chance of being that person, so they're enjoying like impossible advantages that most people in the UK have no chance of attaining. So
you sound like the socialist there.
That's I'm kidding. Only because those people are the net beneficiaries of totalitarian regimes.
But how would you? Okay, so because the law has to be very straightforward with these things, and the law is always very dumb and not very nuanced. What law would you implement, and how would you define that law to prevent them from doing that?
Very tricky.
Tax on second homeowners increasing with each property exponentially. That's what I would do. So you can still own multiple properties. It's just that you have to pay above the market rate consistently for each subsequent property that you want to purchase. So there's nothing stopping you from purchasing 10 properties, other than you have to pay way above the market rate. So then it becomes less cost efficient to do so. That's what I would do. But I don't know what other people think.
You could just have a restrictive list of which countries are allowed to buy. Something like that. I mean, I don't tend towards liking just like blocking market activities. It just strikes me that in that particular case, how are you going to stop like some billionaire who's enjoyed every single advantage going from the Communist Party in China and has now made billions buying up all of London?
Because if you get him to tax, so for property 1, he pays the market rate. For property 2, he pays 10% plus on market rate. For property 3, 20%, and so on and so forth. That guy, yeah, he might have 5, 6, 7, whatever, 20 billion in the bank, but if he buys up all that property, it's inefficient for him to do so, and then the UK is actually gaining resources out of it that it can reallocate, and he has no incentive to do that. So I think that's one way of dealing with it.
Aside from ego, some oligarchs have some obscene wealth where that won't matter to them because it's a point of pride.
It will matter to them though, because if you purchase 100 properties and on property 100 you're paying like 20 times the market rate or whatever it would be if you extrapolate it out. No one's going to do that. Like, people with ridiculous resources aren't idiots. Like, I mean, and if they do it, surely we should be dancing for every house they purchase, because they basically just bought 10 houses for the sake of one. Surely, like, that's amazing. Right?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I can't pick it about on the face of it.
I mean, the only negative is that you're not free to operate as you would want. That's the negative. The guy can't come in and buy as many things as he wants. That is the negative aspect. But the positive is that you don't end up with massive amounts of housing concentrated in the hands of a tiny amount of people if you have to pay absurd market rates for them. And if you do, it's like you said, yeah, it's just an ego boost, but fine. I'm more than happy for people to get their ego boost if they're paying, you know, ridiculous rates for what they're purchasing. Fine by me.
Why can't you just make a rule where you have to be a UK national to own property?
Because why should we ban people? Because if people are buying things here, but they're paying way above market rate for them voluntarily, surely that's a good thing for us, not a bad thing.
I mean, and you've also got to, if you take how difficult it is to get citizenship currently, it becomes a little bit more difficult if, let's say, you are a foreign national who comes and settles in the UK and decides that they're going to live here, and it takes them 15 years or so on to get that they go on to get full citizenship. They make that decision. You know, can you stop people from doing it? I think I don't have a problem with foreign nationals owning property in general. It's a problem with foreign nationals owning property only for the financial gain that owning lots of property that they're never going to live in comes with.
What about some form of like residence card system or something? So if you spend within say at least several weeks or a couple of months within the UK every year or something along the lines, you could have some sort of resident permit to purchase, maybe.
That kind of exists already to some extent in the UK.
I know there's a resident card, but
yeah,
to buy the actual property itself, you don't need any form of permit, do you?
No. So you're saying you need a permit and need to live here for most of the year in order to buy further properties? Is that what you mean?
No, not necessarily most of the year, but at least spend enough time in the UK so you can actually. So you're not just buying the property and staying abroad, but owning the property. You actually have to spend a certain amount of time in the UK in order to own the property. So it makes you a frequent visitor to the UK, as it were, a friend of the UK, shall we say? And yeah. In terms of like factories and stuff, you of course, if it's a factory, so it's a business, you have to actually have a UK business in order to own certain size properties. Maybe, I don't know.
What another thing that happens that people tend not to look at, and Sowell's got a book called The Housing Boom and Bust, where he started talking about this. Is that, I mean, like in the area that I live, you know, in a well-known area, just to kind of in the suburbs of London, and you know, the house prices are quite high around here. But one of the things that happen is that all of the residents have it kind of within their interest to restrict building. So, and it becomes like an environmental issue, quote unquote, to protect green lands. But obviously, the people who push for that are people who have everything to benefit from no new houses being built in this area, which pushes the prices up. So there is something on the other side, which is the prevention of new things being built, which tends towards concentrating people in a given area, and pushes the house prices up, and then it pushes people out and out and out because no new houses are being built.
But doesn't that kind of align with, I imagine, what you would think anyway, which is that why do those people have the right to decide what is being built and not built on land that they don't own, just because they're in a close proximity to it? Like, I don't think that within reason, obviously, if someone's erecting a sewage plant next to your house and a multiplex cinema on the other side, you know, that's one thing. But building a new house, like, why do people that have no right over the land get to have any say? That's just, to me, that's...
Yeah, so they're using the strong arm of the state to create kind of monopoly conditions for their own properties. That's basically what's happening there. So,
yep.
Okay, I think that's where we're going to end it for this evening. But thank you all very much for coming on. We've discussed how freedom from want disincentivizes moving on, progression, and employment, the dangers or lack thereof of automation, population changes throughout time in terms of employment, and the regulation of economic freedom for foreign actors. Thank you very much for joining me, Sarah Lavelle, Ben Brown, Harry G, and Academic Agent. Our next principle that we will be discussing is going to be democracy. I think it is. Is that right, Ben?
I believe it is democracy. Yes, I've got my little thing here. No, wait. It should be. What order are we going through?
Just in order. Just in order.
So the third one was economic freedom. The fourth one is freedom of speech, based on the list on the page.
Yeah, freedom of speech. Then we will be discussing next time. So stay tuned. We hope to have another one of these out each week. So next weekend, keep an eye. Thank you all very much for coming, and cheers.
Later.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.